Welcome to Lesson 10 of our Cultural Diversity Training. This lesson is about individuals and families of Arab descent. So in this lesson, we're going to explore the very rich diversity of Arab American communities. We're going to look into their histories of migration, their cultural values, and some of the challenges that they face in the U.S. And we're also going to cover some counseling considerations, some risks and resiliencies that they have, and some ways to integrate culturally competent approaches. So this lesson emphasizes both understanding cultural heterogeneity and practicing advocacy-oriented, respectful counseling. Arab American communities are incredibly heterogeneous. So they can trace their ancestries back to the Arabian Peninsula. But for a lot of people in the United States, terms like Arab or Middle Eastern, they're associated with complex mix of images and impressions, but very few facts. Efforts to clarify those boundaries and the contents of those terms are really necessary for us as we're seeking to increase our multicultural competence. And, there's not just one comprehensive definition of what the Middle East is or its Arab citizens. So the region centering around the Persian Gulf became known to English speakers as the Middle East or the Near Orient in the 1900s. So this central position here makes it kind of a crossroads of strategic importance here because it's such a coveted geographic region. There have been centuries of important historical events that happened in the Middle East, and this is one of the earliest cradles of civilization. It's a rich area of religious history and symbolism because we have the cities of Jerusalem and we have Mecca inside of the boundaries of it. And some of those religious groups have been coexisting in the Middle East, and that's going to be the Muslims, the Christians, the Jews, the Druze, and so on. And there's just this confluence of political and spiritual activity. And so that means that the Middle East holds really great diversity in a really small area. And it's going to have both Arab speaking and the non Arab speaking countries, like Iran, because they speak Farsi, Turkey and Israel. There's different languages. So the people, the citizens in the Middle East, they're not Arabs. People who trace their ancestries there are going to be like Kurds and Berbers and Chaldeans, and they're not considered to be Arabs. But geographically, Arabs are persons who have ancestral ties to that Saudi Arabian peninsula, and historically they practice Islam. And about 80% of Arabs in the Middle East are Muslim. So these categories are not completely overlapping here. The majority of the Muslims in the world are going to reside outside of the Middle East. So it's inaccurate to consider Arab and Muslim to be synonymous. And then they have the common use of the Arabic language. That's kind of been another way to indicate Arab people, but that's strategies, not without its own problems. Arabs can also be described in varying ways, like race or skin color. So it's really most or more important to really consider Arab an ethical or an ethnic or like a cultural category here. So I'm going to use Arab American to mean any individual who identifies themselves as part of that ethnic group. And they maybe have a heritage linked to the League of Arab States. A lot of the contemporary scholars define those as being of Arab descent, originally from the Arab Middle East. And when I talk about the League of Arab States, this was founded in 1945, and currently there's 22 states. So it's going to be Algeria, Bahrain, Comoros, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, Palestine, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, all of that area right there. And it's even going to include Somalia, Sudan, Syria, Tunisia, the United Arab Emirates, Yemen, and a couple of others. And these are sometimes grouped into the Gulf states, like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Oman. Then we have like Greater Syria, which is going to include Iraq and Lebanon, and part of the area of North Africa. So these are all Arab, or not all of them, but some of them are Arab-speaking countries, and there are some that are not part of that Arab League. So this alliance points to the diversity of the Arab world, with some of these countries having significant Western influence, like Lebanon, and other countries are fairly isolated from that influence, like Sudan or Yemen. And dialect of spoken Arabic, the cultural, the religious traditions, the political history, the geography, these are all dimensions along with the Arab League countries, and they're all going to be different. And they've all been subject to colonialism over the past couple of centuries by the Western entities. So the Arab Middle East has really faced a variety of pressures. And although the U.S. is currently the most powerful Western country that's attempting to influence the Arab Middle East, we've seen, in the past, Britain and France, they've historically held colonies and swayed policy in that region. And some of the borders that are disputed today were dictated at the end of World War I when that Ottoman Empire was carved up by the victorious Allies. But this political history is really complex, and it takes on an increased importance in the light of the current struggles among the Western powers and the various religions and, whatever. So there's misunderstandings, there's going to be conflicts, there's going to be wars that have contributed to the flow of Arab refugees and immigrants that are now populating the U.S., and they may be seeking out counseling services. So Arabs came to the U.S. in 4 distinct waves of immigration, and each group had different reasons for immigrating. So they had different characteristics, they had different experiences in their host or their adopted country. So this first group of immigrants, typically they came from Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and Jordan. And that was at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. Most of them were Christians, and they just wanted to escape that Islamic Ottoman Empire. And they tended to be uneducated laborers with very little in the way of like material resources. So when they got here, they really just maintained their communities by settling in these ethnic enclaves in the various cities in the US. And their religion allowed them to settle into Christian influenced areas with a lot fewer challenges than the Muslim immigrants are going to face later on. And then the second group of the Arab immigrants, they came after World War II. And so they were kind of fleeing out of their homelands because of the political tensions, like the Palestinians who were escaping that civil war in 1948 because the British mandate in that area expired and the territories were seized by Israel. And this second wave also includes Syrians, Jordanians, Egyptians, Iraqis, and a lesser extent Lebanese and Yemenis. So some have called this the brain drain because those who left were educated Muslims, which, they had the means to escape those undesirable situations. And then the third wave of immigrants was pretty much comprised predominantly of educated Muslims, and this group was searching for, better lives as part of that American dream. And so immigration restrictions had been eased in the 1960s, so it was a little easier to take advantage of that opportunity. And a lot of the people were arriving at this time, they were Palestinians who just wanted to escape that Israeli occupation. And then finally, the Persian Gulf War created a situation where refugees had very few options left, so they were compelled to flee from that area. And that group included Iraqis who were working for the U.S. in their war efforts in the region and were facing some pretty harsh consequences for that choice. So the renewed conflict in the region is likely to lead more Iraqi refugees in the United States. But, it's not really well documented because of, how recently it's been. So Arab Americans, they come from a variety of backgrounds. They've made their homes in the U.S. at varying times for varying reasons, and um, just the history, the culture, the religion of the country of origin, whatever, is going to continue to influence Arabs in their new communities. But it's also possible to meet a fourth or fifth generation Arab American from whom this country is, or was their only frame of reference. So let's take a moment to kind of discover some more of these hidden famous people who are Arab American in just a moment when we do our reflection activity. But before we do that, I want to think about this. Pat Davis was being interviewed on NPR, and he was one of the owners of Abe's Barbecue in Clarksdale, Mississippi. And he was talking about his father, who was the original owner of that restaurant in 1924. And his father was an immigrant from Lebanon. Just another Lebanese immigrant to that Delta area, Shafiq Shimon. He was telling about how he started that business by going door to door peddling goods to his neighbors. And no one really had very much back then in the 1950s. And sometimes his neighbors would just buy from him to help sustain him for just one more week. Not because they needed anything or that they had much to spare for themselves, but he opened his restaurant in 1960 and he had the chance to return the favor. So the civil rights era had created enormous tensions between the African Americans and the European Americans. So the Lebanese immigrants in the southeast were among some of the few who would serve food to their black patrons. And I was a little bit surprised by this history. Generations of Arab Americans building the culture of the U.S. in ways that I hadn't expected. And it's also a little bit touching by the willingness of people on the margin to help each other, looking past their differences and seeing the commonness of humanity. So take a moment to just kind of jot down, what are your thoughts and feelings about this history? And how might this influence your work with Arab American clients? So Arab Americans often experience what's called the forever foreigner stereotype. It's kind of this sense that no matter how many generations that they've lived here, they're still treated like they're outsiders. And this really intensified after 9/11 when suspicion and Islamophobia spiked dramatically. Some of the forms of discrimination include hate crimes and harassment, so verbal slurs like terrorist or even physical assaults. And then we have like microaggressions, which are constant questions like, where are you really from? Or maybe assumptions about political views. And then there's workplace discrimination, job loss, hiring barriers, underemployment based on last names or accents or their perceived religions. Then there's school bullying, students who wear hijabs or, maybe they fast for Ramadan. Maybe they're harassed or excluded. And so for clients, these experiences create mistrust of our systems, including the healthcare system and the counseling system. And our role is to validate their experiences, not minimize them. Acknowledgement is typically that first step toward rebuilding trust. And we know that the post 9/11 US really became intent on securing its borders against real or perceived threats. And they engaged in some preemptive actions in the name of, the war on terror. So the tragedy of the attacks of the World Trade Towers is certainly real, but the backlash suffered by the American Arab community, it was a lot. Changes in national policy like the Patriot Act really altered some of the civil liberties that were taken for granted in the U.S., like the expectation not to be under surveillance or not to be detained without cause. And the Arab Americans, as well as, other leading civil rights advocates, challenged whether those policies are fairly implemented rather than used to target the people that are perceived as like Middle Eastern or Arab. And these acts of profiling perpetuate the stereotypes of Arab Americans as Muslims or extremists. And then the hate crimes and the profiling against U.S. citizens and immigrants, regardless of how closely they do or don't fit with that stereotypical Middle Eastern image, really went up dramatically after 9/11. The Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, or the ADC, listed over 600 attacks against persons who were the perpetrators, assumed to be Muslim Arabs in the months following September 11th. So, like, for example, the Sikhs were they're often of Indian descent and they're not Muslim. They were attacked for their custom of wearing a turban. And, most non-Arab Americans have not participated in overt acts of violence. And these actions really were attributed to the extreme element. And alongside the many Arab American organizations that publicly condemned the 9/11 attacks, a lot of non-Arab American counterparts expressed their view via public opinion polls. That the U.S., on the foundation and spirit of tolerance, should extend the benefit of the doubt to the citizens of this country who just happen to be Arab. And the stereotypes of Arabs, as these like callous oil barons, desert nomads, religious zealots, and repressive dictators, that does not help to promote the intercultural understanding. These images come to the U.S. in movies or fictional novels and even the news media and educational textbooks. There's very few normalized images to counter those exaggerated and falsified images that are really permeating the U.S. culture and consciousness. But most U.S. citizens would have a hard time envisioning an average Arab or Arab American family just sitting down to dinner in the evening and celebrating a wedding or grieving at a funeral or getting ready for work or school in the morning or making purchases at a store. It's ironic and it's sad that in the current historical moment, images of roadside bombings in Baghdad may be more familiar than images of, neighboring Arab Americans in their daily lives. So let's just take a few moments to look up some famous Arab Americans on this website that I've provided here. I just want you to select an individual or a group of individuals of interest. What kind of stereotypes might they represent? Think about how those stereotypes may have originated and how the current socio-political climate either promotes or discourages those current stereotypes. So, as is true with any large and varied ethnic group, it is kind of an overgeneralization to say that every Arab American is going to adhere to just this equal extent to the cultural values that I've been mentioning. So, let's talk about some of these that may be moderated over time by exposure to the U.S. culture. But they may also be maintained by strong family systems and these ethnic enclaves or communities. Collectivism, religion, faith, education, work, economic status, and communication styles. Above all else, Arab Americans should be understood as holding this collective worldview. Um, as opposed to the U.S. system where individuals are expected to become more independent as they're maturing, Arab Americans are likely to continue seeing themselves as kind of part of this extended family and community structure. So decisions are made within that context, and help is sought from other members of that collective group. Uh, Appropriate behavior is defined by, the shared beliefs of the community. And interdependence is a value. It's a kind of a sign of dedication and loyalty to that group. So career counseling, for example, would have a very different feel in this collective context, as opposed to the context of like helping clarify the work-related interests of a person. So one person would be expected to sacrifice individual goals or needs for the sake of the extended family. So, as one common proverb emphasizes, we rise together, we fall together. So, the strength of the collective bonds within the group may promote the tendency toward almost like clannish behavior, and it causes separation between themselves and other people who have different, countries of origins, religious preferences, races, and so on. And there's another proverb that says, it is my brother and I against our cousin, but it is my cousin and I against a stranger. So collective societies, they're going to value trust. So outsiders have to work to gain favor through, sustained demonstrations of knowledge, awareness, and just skillful assistance. But before trust is earned, individualistic U.S. Influences have to be viewed with some suspicion. One example is like the parenting styles of Arab Americans. They're more authoritative than the parenting styles of Arabs in their home countries. So the U.S. cultural values viewed, as a potential threat to the structure of the Arab American family and its value system, particularly in the case of Muslims. So parents may impose social constraints on young girls to prevent them from falling prey to the sexual permissiveness of the other problematic U.S. influences. And counselors in schools may not really understand a family's request that their daughter not wear a swimsuit or enter a pool, but push the family to maybe reconsider, and that may only heighten their sense of value conflict and cause them to become even more resolved to protect their children. And then we have like extended family systems. These are common within Arab households. And that tradition may be carried on in the US, but if immigration patterns have really disrupted that connection among the generations, then the roles of elders may be picked up by other members of that ethnic enclave. And these communities tend to be really close knit and they share common places of origin. If not blood. And these relationships with like grandmother or auntie are an important source of stability. And they're very important to assess within the context of counseling. And counselors in any setting should be careful to ask about family or other important relationships in a very broad and inclusive way. So, counseling related to family issues should really be undertaken with the understanding that, relationships are going to be close and interdependent in a way that might be described as enmeshed if we were working with an individualistic family. So we need to take care not to label those relationships as unhealthy or inappropriate if they're just simply adhering to the different cultural standards. Now, jumping into religion and faith, the religious diversity of the Arab American community is an aspect that might surprise people unfamiliar with its traditions. The Islamic heritage of some Arab Americans has received a lot of attention due to, the distinctiveness from that dominant religious tradition of the United States. So it is true that, the majority of Arabs in the Middle East are Muslim, but the largest religious group within Arab Americans is Catholic at about 35%. Only about 24% of Arab Americans practice Islam, and another 20% are Orthodox. And then we have another 11% that practice a Protestant religion. And then the final 13% of Arab Americans describe themselves as not having a religious affiliation. So, recalling the fact that the Arab Middle East is the birthplace for several of those traditions, it makes sense that there would be a range of practices among Arab descendants from that region. So, this immigration process may selectively bring more members of one group than another to a host country. So it's logical that the percentage of Arab Muslims residing in the U.S. is different than the percentage of Arab Muslims in their region of origin. And because less might be known about Islam than some of the other more dominant U.S. faiths, we need to know a little bit more. Islam began between the years of 7 and 10 AD when the Prophet Muhammad began to deliver God's messages in the Arab areas, the Arabian Peninsula. And Muhammad didn't claim to be divine, but he said he received divine revelations from the archangel Gabriel. And these messages from Allah, or the Arabic word for God, were written and became known as the Quran. And so in this way, the Quran is not drastically different from the Old or the New Testaments of the Bible, which were God's revelations delivered through faithful messengers that he picked. So Muhammad himself was actually an orphan at a young age and was raised in Mecca by family and community who tended to practice the polytheistic traditions. And Muhammad made the firm decision to worship only one God, the God of his ancestor Abraham. So of interest here, it is written that the progeny of Abraham's son Isaac became Jews and the progeny of Abraham's son Ishmael became Muslim. And a lot of these Muslims view Islam not merely their religion, but their guide for everyday life. Islamic law is written to help believers lead ethical lives that respect other people and promote peace. So the very word Islam means peace through submission, which would not condone actions taken with the express purpose of hurting or terrorizing another person or group. And so the goal of global unity is supported by Islamic ethics, and it's going to include religious unity and racial and ethnic unity. So for counselors who may not typically include religion as a topic of assessment, the presence of Islamic ethics is, all parts of daily life. And that means it's an important influence that we could miss if we don't ask. And then another misconception of Islam is that it asks women to be subservient to men. Really, males and females are considered by Islam to be equals before God. So Muslim women are allowed to obtain education, own property, make their own decisions about marriage and divorce and voting, and they also pray the same way that men do. But as with a lot of these other activities in traditional Arab Muslim households, the genders are separated. So depending on the attitudes of the imam or the religious leader, women typically dress modestly, particularly when they go to pray in the mosque. And they generally pray in a separate women-only area. And it should be noted that the local customs may interact with Islam in a way to limit the women's rights, although that's typically due to the socio-political influences of that particular country rather than a tenet of Islam. Okay, so some of the customs might appear different at first. And there's a lot of common ground among Islam and Christianity and Judaism. Like the Catholic tradition that exists in Arab American communities has its roots in the Crusades of the 12th century. And the Maronites that are mostly from Lebanon, and the Melkites that are the Greek Catholics. There were also some Orthodox groups that kind of split from Rome and the Catholic Church, like the Egyptian Coptics, the Syrians, the Greek Orthodox. And so for these Arab Americans and their Protestant counterparts, the traditions in the U.S. don't represent a dramatic departure from their customary worship. And just like a lot of the other U.S. groups that associate with religion, there are Arab Americans who adhere strongly to their faith traditions, and they maintain a daily or weekly practice. And others are going to spend relatively less time attending religious services or, in other spiritual matters. The degree of religiosity is an important aspect to learn about in the counseling relationship, especially with stereotypes about extremist Muslims influencing the U.S. opinions about the more typical members of the group. Religion for Arab Americans of any faith tradition is often a source of comfort and strength. It's a valued connection to cultural roots and a resource in times of difficulty. And so for Muslims in particular, as a religious minority in the U.S., that strain of being misunderstood and maybe even being mistreated in everyday life can be counterbalanced by time spent with other Muslims at the mosque. And so the sense of community that's generated in the mosque is going to extend beyond religion to the social, the psychological, and also the physical well-being of its members. So the imam might be sought for counsel in handling the daily stressors, and the worshipers may assist each other with issues related to family life, work, and education, just like if it was a Christian church or a Catholic church. And these daily transactions with non-Muslims have meant that members of the Islamic faith must integrate themselves with the wider community to an extent. But in personal matters of like value, religion, and family, Muslims may choose to maintain their cultural traits and traditions. So for a counselor working with a traditional Arab American of Islamic faith, the option to include an imam or other important religious figure in the process may be greatly appreciated by the client, but we need to ask. And then let's jump into education, work, and economic status here. Contrary to some of those stereotypes, education is really strongly encouraged for boys and girls alike in the Arab American community. And although the school children in the Arab Middle East may be segregated by gender, Arab American children are going to follow the norms of the school system in the United States. Some children are going to attend private Islamic schools, and they're going to learn Arabic culture and language, but there are students in the public schools of their communities. So education and professional preparation are both emphasized across the Arab Middle East, and therefore it's carried over into the United States. So the community has a laudable record of educational accomplishment, with 85% of Arab Americans have a high school diploma and over 40% have bachelor's degrees. Arab Americans tend to have career paths that are similar to other groups in this country, although there are a lot more participating in businesses and entrepreneurial activities, and a lot fewer participating in government. And we kind of know the reason for that. Some of the most recent immigrants may have professions and educational certifications from their home countries, but maybe they're not able to practice those professions in the United States. So the overall rate of employment among Arab Americans is high, as is the household income. And that doesn't really mean that Arab Americans would not present for career-related counseling, but they typically are already employed. So in addition to some of the typical career-related concerns as seen with any client, like occupational exploration, workforce transition issues, balancing their career or their family, or just any other adjustments, the Arab Americans may also discuss issues that are work-related, like workplace discrimination, expectations from a collective cultural viewpoint, or maybe the impact of immigration or cultural adjustment on their work. And then lastly, let's delve into communication styles here. And because counseling is an activity that's highly dependent upon the quality of communication, it's going to be important to understand some manners of expression that Arab Americans may use. Some of the characteristics that are different from the average U.S. conversational style, like maybe using non-verbal gestures to express emotion, or maybe they are seeking comfort with touching or standing in close proximity while communicating. Maybe they use high volume or repetition to emphasize a critical point. And at the same time, this expressiveness may not really extend to the sharing of emotional feelings or issues. Arab Americans might be reluctant to share in that way, particularly with people outside of their culture. And they may be reluctant to say anything negative about another person, especially people in their family or their community. And then, they kiss cheeks as a greeting and hold hands, even the adult males. That's common in the Middle East, and these customs may not be observed in the U.S. Maybe there's a hierarchy in terms of communication among family members, with like the emphasis on the children speaking respectfully to the elders, and women being respectful to men while they're in public settings. So we need to take this in consideration, because if counseling is being sought for marriage or family related issues, maybe we want to separate the husband and wife before working jointly with them, so that we have the opportunity to hear the woman's concerns when she's not constrained by that custom to defer to her husband. If the counselor is seen as an authority figure, the client in any setting might expect them to provide concrete solutions to problems rather than just ask questions designed to promote insight into the situation. Arab Americans may initially be, reserved with members of other ethnic groups until there's an initial sense of trust established, especially in matters when it's like emotional importance. And some of our clients could feel that they're betraying their families by sharing personal matters with an outsider, like the counselor. Another tendency that may impact counseling is the Middle Eastern tradition of gender separation during certain activities. So same gender pairs, where available, may be a little bit more comfortable for Arab American clients. Like if the client is male, they may want to be paired with a male therapist, and if the client is female, pair them with a female therapist. So both the communication style and the content of the counseling session are going to be impacted by all of these trends, and it would be most relevant with the client who holds fast to the cultural traditions there. So as a counselor, particularly a non-Arab one, learning a few key Arabic greetings or other phrases along with some of those cultural traditions for your clients would go a long way in building rapport there. So acculturation among Arab Americans exists on a continuum. We have the traditional, which is the strong adherence to the heritage, the language, and the customs. We have the bicultural, which balances the heritage and the mainstream values, and that person is navigating both of those. Then we have the highly acculturated, which is largely assimilated, sometimes rejecting heritage traditions. And then we have the marginal. This is detached from both cultures, and that's going to create a sense of isolation. So understanding where a client or a family is along this spectrum is really essential for us. Like, for instance, a conflict may come up when parents are traditional, but the children are bicultural, or they're highly acculturated. Ethnic identity adds complexity. A Lebanese Christian family will differ in worldview from a Yemeni Muslim family, even though both are Arab. And gender roles are also going to vary. Sometimes the strongly patriarchy, sometimes maybe they're flexible. And so counselors need to avoid overgeneralizing while still recognizing the cultural patterns. I had a client who wanted to feed her children the traditional meals from the home country. And the husband, who was an American, a white American, did not want to feed the children that. And after they separated their marriage, it was very difficult for her, because anytime the children went over there, they ate completely different than how she cooked at home, and there was an argument about how she was feeding the children. So it might even show up in just cooking or cleaning patterns or caring for the children patterns and how the family is made up. If you've never traveled outside of the country of your birth, just take a moment to imagine what it would look like to experience such a profound change. Almost everything that you take for granted at this moment could be different. Looking out your window, maybe you see a geography that's unfamiliar, and it causes simple acts like just getting dressed for the day or choosing a method of transportation to be challenging. If you find a food substance that's to your liking for breakfast, then maybe you might leave your residence and try to navigate your way through a world that includes signs and conversations that maybe you don't understand. And work or leisure activities that you cannot participate in because of laws or lack of familiarity or lack of preparation. And if you're accustomed to being respected as a woman or as a practitioner of a certain religion or of a certain profession, or maybe as a member of an approved social class, that respect might not be offered to you now. Support systems that you relied on before, like family, friends, schools, churches, could be either partly or completely absent. People that you pass on the way might not look anything like you, and they also might be curious about your appearance, your manner of dress, your hair. And depending on the distance between this new place and your home, you might not be able to rely on seeing all those familiar things again for quite some time. Maybe you had to leave your home at a very young age or due to a crisis, and you're still trying to understand what happened. You might have to worry for the first time in your life how you're going to find food or shelter. It may not be clear who can help you with those necessities. Take a moment and just jot down what emotions are emerging here for you. How does this build empathy for our immigrant clients? Non-Arab U.S. citizens may hold multiple stereotypes about Arabs or Arab American women, particularly those who are Muslim, because we have the movie images of like harem girls doing belly dances, and then we have like news images of oppressed women that are cloaked in dark fabrics, who can't leave the house or drive a car or have an opinion. And as is true with a lot of stereotypes, these images are not a good portrait of the majority of Arab women, and even less so of the Arab American women. Um, so this particular lesson, we talk a lot about Arab daughters, or what we call bent Arabs. We want to understand that some of the traditional social norms from the Middle East that encourage separation of the sexes for various activities are particularly hard for Americans to understand. And from the U.S. perspective, it is unfair to put girls in separate classrooms. But in Arab Muslim perspectives, that segregation is going to protect from the harassment or inappropriate male behavior. And from a traditional Arab perspective, allowing an unmarried and sexually protected young woman to go on a date with a young man would be putting herself and her reputation in danger. But the U.S. perspective sees it as a necessary ritual for finding a partner. And the lack of such restrictions for young men does indicate a double standard, but Arab culture would not be the only one to provide differing social instructions to women and men. Arab American women may decide to adhere to their culture's gender role to different extents. So some may pray or worship in a setting apart from men and, improve their focus on God, yet they might work and share living space comfortably with men. And some may be third or fourth generation American women who feel less of a connection to that distant country of the Arab Middle East. The important point for the counselors is to explore the client's perspective on gender without perception or this conception or like judgment based on those different stereotypes. Another example of like variations of Muslim Arab American gender identity is like the practice of veiling. And the use of the veil may be viewed by non-Muslims as oppressive, but Muslim women and girls who agree to wear veils may see it as a sign of, their religious devotion and a cultural pride. And some women who veil their face or they dress in a modest attire also indicate that they feel free to develop their minds and opinions when attention is taken away from their physical selves. Other Muslim women may have maybe they're ambivalent with that practice of veiling, and they accept it at certain times and places in their lives, and they reject it at others. And it's the same with a lot of other things. It's easier to reject and criticize that which we don't understand as an outsider to a community. So women who wear veils, they haven't really forfeited their rights. They can study, they can choose professions, they can exercise authority in the family and in the community. And sometimes they're going to face discrimination for adhering to that choice in a non-Muslim setting like work or school. And some European countries have recently debated laws about not allowing students to veil in public schools. So, whether or not a Muslim woman wears a veil, her religious identity and her gender identity can still take a variety of different forms. The degree of religiosity has more influence on the content of the gender roles for Arab American women than being Christian or Muslim. So, a more fundamental belief system tends to be a little bit more restrictive on how men and women should act, regardless of their actual religion. Like Christian Arab American or non Arab American women may strongly be opposed to the practice of premarital sex. So, counselors who meet a client for the first time and observe her wearing a veil would be wise not to make interpretations about that choice until other aspects of the client's personality and values become clear. And it can be complicated to construct a gender identity if a person is influenced by two fairly distinctive cultural or religious traditions. So let's move on here. Mental health issues often come up from external stressors rather than an internal pathology. Oppression and discrimination lead to anxiety or depression and mistrust of institutions. Acculturated stress affects both the parents and the children, and that's often going to create intergenerational conflict. Identity struggles, whether they're ethnic or gender or sexual, those are going to compound stress, especially when the clients feel caught between the heritage expectations and some of these mainstream US norms that we have here. Some other psychosocial issues are going to include survivor's guilt among refugees, trauma from war displacement, feelings of invisibility in our US society. And so, as counselors, we have to frame these struggles as valid responses to systemic challenges, not as individual failings. And as popular media sources portray Arabs and Arab Americans in a manner that reflects the politically tense relations between the U.S. and various Arab Middle East countries, these portrayals are then internalized by both non-Arab Americans and as they're learning more about the individuals of Arab descent, as well as, the Arab Americans themselves, because they're learning about themselves, particularly, those in the earlier stages of developing their cultural identities. And so both overt and the covert discrimination, these are going to be detrimental to the mental health of people, to, toward who those acts are being directed, obviously. So the ethnic pride can either be promoted or discouraged by this oppression. And if it's appropriately developed or supported, it can serve as a strong source of resilience among those Arab Americans. So let's meet Ahmed. He's a Saudi Arabian middle schooler. He was born in Saudi Arabia, and when he was 10 years old, his father um, was a university administrator, and he took a position at a Midwestern U.S. university to direct the new Middle East Studies program there. Um, and they were about an hour outside a large Arab American community or enclave. And so his family, his mom, his dad, his three brothers, and he had one sister, they all relocated to the United States for an indefinite time period. And Ahmed is now in middle school in their urban community school system. And there's another, a small number of Arab American students in that school community. And some of the other kids are second and third generation Arab Americans from Lebanon, although they still maintain strong ties to their ethnic heritage. Another group is first generation students from Yemen, and they're a relatively rural country with a lower socioeconomic and educational base. And along with those groups, there's a military base within a few hours from the city. And so a large number of the students in the school have at least one parent affiliated with the U.S. military, with some of them currently being deployed in Iraq. So Ahmed is often feeling lonely and sad, and he doesn't really seem to fit in with the other group of Arab American students, even though most of them, except for some of the Lebanese students, are Muslim. So the U.S. cultural norms They're harder to adhere to because he speaks English with an Arabic accent. He's less acculturated to these norms. And the Lebanese group, they call him a boater, like they do the Yemeni students. And the Yemeni students also don't accept him because he comes from a more affluent and educated background than they do. And then when there are military and political flare-ups related to any situation in Iraq, some of the students in the school make anti-Arab remarks to him, along with the other kids, about going back to where they came from and calling them camel jockeys and so on. So more and more attention has been given to researching the various types of stressors that are accompanied by this acculturation process. Along with learning a new language and cultural customs, immigrants have to learn to navigate within an entirely new societal structure of education, employment, and government, among other things. And so these transitions are often very challenging, particularly with, transferring from formal levels of education or employment credentials to like new host systems that might not recognize them. So it might be difficult to maybe determine student grade level within a new structure, particularly among post-secondary institutions. And it might also be challenging at times, maybe even impossible for professionals to have their former credentials recognized in reciprocity. So maybe a pharmacist in their country of origin might either have to undergo an entire training program in the US in order to achieve that US recognized credential, or just forego that career path altogether. And understandably, these difficulties can sometimes lead to anxiety or depression, especially among recent immigrants. And resilience with this arena can be fostered if the immigrants are able to appropriately transfer their former training, if not their credentials, to maybe comparable or similar careers in the new host country. And then intergenerational stress among both the recent and the later generations of immigration is going to pose additional family stressors. And in some cases, English language acquisition hasn't really been fully achieved, particularly by the parents or the older generation. And so the children may inadvertently be placed in a situation of having to translate notes or other directives from the school to their parents. And that creates a role reversal in terms of like that traditional hierarchy. And then also like rules or expectations from the culture or the origin may be stricter or otherwise different from that which is recognized by the school or the community or their peers. And that's going to cause conflicts in the parenting arena. So like rules about curfews or dating or other aspects of supervised activities may be imposed, and that may result in the children feeling different from their peers whom they're trying to fit in with. And these situations pose an additional stressor for all the generations and the family members involved. So dialogue among Arab American youth and families around these acculturation issues is going to yield some self-exploration opportunities of both the psycho-emotional stressors as well as some of the cultural strengths and the positive values. So let's meet the Aldines. They moved to the United States approximately 15 years ago. And Mr. Aldine Abdullah was a young business professional in his family's business in Algeria. And several of his brothers and sisters are also involved in the business. And an opportunity came up at that time for him to develop a branch of the business in the United States. And his wife, Nafisa, at the time decided to take the opportunity for economic advancement. So they had that discussion, they decided together, and she had studied to be a nurse in Algeria and hoped to practice in the United States. So during the first 15 years of settling into their new life in the United States, Abdullah's business became prosperous. And at the same time, Nafisa was unable to pursue nursing because she would have had to complete a new degree program in nursing in the US in order to obtain her nursing credentials. So with English being a third language after Arabic and French, she decided to indefinitely postpone that idea until after raising a family. And then over the years, the Aldines had 4 children, the elder 2 being girls. And they did not live in an Arabic enclave. And Nafisa had decided early on that she would begin wearing a hijab, or veiling herself. And it was not that she felt unsafe in the community, but she just felt more comfortable wearing conservative clothing and a headdress that would allow her to feel like she was upholding the cultural value of modesty. And she came from a family that had not practiced that tradition in the past, but she felt in this new environment it would be the best thing to do. And she decided several years ago that her daughters were going to follow this tradition as they approached their preteen years. So, in the recent years, she's had increasing power struggles with her daughters. They want to go out without what she perceives as appropriate supervision, even with boys. And Nafisa has kind of thought about taking them back to Algeria during the summers so that they can learn more about their culture of origin values. And her daughters are worried that she wants to bring them there to marry them off. Nafisa doesn't have much cultural support in the community, and no one to really discuss these issues with. And she's grown increasingly depressed and realized that their decision to move to the United States 15 years ago has created a lot of stressful situations in terms of keeping her daughters protected. Had she just stayed in Algeria, she believes that the environment would be much safer for them. Historically, Arabism and ethnic identity development among Arab Americans has really paralleled their immigration history in the United States. So, as I kind of discussed earlier, um, demographic definitions of Arab Americans, especially within the census arena, have evolved significantly over the years. Paralleling these U.S. trends, along with the overall global reactions and other politics, like the pride in ethnic heritage, and particularly for Arab Americans, didn't really fully emerge until the 1960s. And then over the course of, however many years, the political and other conflicts between the U.S. and the Arab Middle East, as well as some of the domestic acts of violence, either legitimately or falsely attributed to the Arabs or the Arab Americans, has kind of served as like this catalyst for the ebb and flow of the ethnic pride within the Arab American community nationally. Even within the Arab American enclaves, where young people in the midst of their identity development, they might have access to role models and peers sharing their heritage, and negotiating kind of this identity development process in the face of the socio-political challenges hasn't really been easy. So intentional monitoring can support resilience among Arab American youth and among young adults as they're maturing through these stages and processes. And along with the overall identity development, some of these mixed messages about like appropriately gendered development might cause some additional challenges. And these messages can emerge from families of origin or their communities, either the ethnic enclave communities or the communities at large. And of course, we have the media and other sources where young people are constantly exposed. So questions like, should women seek post-secondary or graduate education? Which careers are appropriate for women? Or should I get married? And all of these are thought by young women of most ethnic groups, and Arab Americans are no different. And this issue often is at the crux of related and sometimes concurrent issues, like sexual or career identity development. And so role modeling and mentoring here too is going to promote resilience among Arab American youth, particularly those who might be perceived by themselves or others as in the minority with regard to their sexual orientation or their career choice or any other issues. So let's meet Layla here. Layla is a graduate student in engineering at a university in a large Arab American enclave. Her family is of Lebanese descent, with several of her grandparents being first immigrants from the family. Originally merchants, their family business expanded enough to provide more than adequate financial support for the later generations to better themselves economically. So Layla is not the first of her siblings and cousins to pursue graduate education. She is, however, the first female to pursue a graduate degree in a male dominated field. So, living in the large Arab American community, she does know numerous other young women in her program and knows the struggle that some of them have had in terms of kind of negotiating their gender identities within their families and communities, and also the university program. And that university program is male dominated within student and faculty groups. And she's also started to question her sexuality. She thinks that, some of this questioning may be related to her school environment and lack of role models, but she doesn't really feel comfortable talking to any of her peers about it. And Layla loves the academic challenges of her program, and she has considered going on to pursue a doctorate in engineering. But on the other hand, she's experienced some strain from not having adequate role models or mentoring in her program, and sometimes feels as though she's kind of floundering in her career direction. She hasn't seen many females go on to the doctoral program, even though they may have initially planned to. So, Arab Americans, like their non Arab American counterparts, experience a number of developmental and crisis issues, along with the psychological disorders. And particularly because Arab Americans are not identified as a special population by most government or mental health agencies, there's no specific data on the prevalence of issues within this population as compared to the overall population of communities. So, for recent immigrants who are refugees, there is a high prevalence of post traumatic stress disorder, and that's often accompanied by like elevated rates of anxiety and depression. Um, Along with other psycho-emotional and medical complaints. And these refugees come from Lebanon in the 70s and 80s, and most recently from Iraq. And as veterans and other refugees of the Gulf War and the war on Iraq and whatever, and refugee camps around the world, an accurate diagnosis and treatment of these medical illnesses is a prerequisite to effectively tackling any other issues and developing some overall resilience within this population. The psychosocial issues for Arab Americans are often going to present as somatic or physical issues. Like depression or anxiety, for example, is going to manifest in digestive or sleep or any other number of physical disorders. And this type of pattern is important for all types of healthcare and mental health care to kind of be attuned to when we work with those American or Arab American clients or patients in particular. Again, effective identification and treatment are better going to ensure resilience in working through other related psychosocial issues. Now, let's meet Samir. Samir is a veteran of the Gulf War. He served on the side of the United States against Saddam Hussein, so he was granted amnesty by the United Nations. And he and his family spent 5 years living in a refugee camp in Saudi Arabia before he was granted entry into the United States. And his brother's family was in the same refugee camp, but was assigned refugee status in Australia. And Samir's parents weren't allowed to make a choice. And because Samir's brother had a larger family, even though one of the children had died in the refugee camp, Samir's parents chose to go to Australia. And since being in the US, Samir has felt extremely depressed. He cannot sleep because of his recurrent nightmares about the atrocities witnessed during combat. And he also has nightmares about his children dying. So he's started to gamble in local coffee houses and casinos, and he cannot seem to hold down a job. He was an attorney in Iraq, but he's been working in a convenience store deli delivering food because he can't practice law in the United States. And his wife has threatened to divorce him so that he won't gamble away their meager remaining financial resources. Samir sees his wife having to rely on their eldest son for financial and other household support, but he cannot seem to mobilize himself to do anything about it. So when we're counseling Arab Americans, the approach matters. Building trust by being transparent, respectful, and consistent. That's how we're going to do that. A lot of clients carry that mistrust of systems due to the historical discrimination. The family and the community, they're going to be central. Involving family members in session when appropriate can really enhance credibility and trust. So we want to be mindful that, sensitive issues like gender, sexuality, intergenerational conflict, they may require individual sessions. And we know that the stigma around mental health remains high in a lot of Arab communities. And so the clients are going to feel or they're going to fear that they're going to be judged or shamed. And so they might prefer spiritual healers or religious leaders. So we can support them by normalizing help seeking, emphasizing confidentiality, and integrating culturally congruent practices like prayer, storytelling, and group involvement. So for some of you, you might be a counseling trainee, and this may be your first time. And you are perhaps kind of like a carpenter. You're learning how to use all of the tools assembled in your tool belt. And the first few times that you hold them, they're going to seem awkward. But with repeated practice, they're going to become more familiar to you. You're a little bit unlike a carpenter because in that your most important tool is yourself. You would kind of make an analogy that like a tool belt represents your personality and your skills, your life history, your view on the world. So in order to help clients of any culture or background, you should be familiar with the tools of our trade, like the theoretical approaches, the techniques, the methods for assessing and evaluating problems, exercises to improve health or work through those problems, some of the resources out there for assistance. And we have to also understand what is the condition of our tool belt. What's the state of your knowledge or awareness or skills with respect to Arab American clients? Have you taken an opportunity to broaden your horizons by talking to people from a variety of backgrounds? Do you recognize any stereotypes or limited ideas present in your thinking about Arab Americans? Do you have an emotional response to the information in this lesson? Think back to the acculturation visualization I had you do earlier. Recall some of the feelings that came to you as you just imagined yourself in a whole new world with very little that was comforting or familiar. The empathy that you now have as a result of trying to walk in someone else's shoes while still acknowledging that there can be limits to your understanding is a part of you. So to reach out to a client, counselors have to use some of what they know as a part of the human experience and some of what they've learned about the journeys of others and some tools that may clarify or resolve the physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual stress of that client. So I want you to spend some time thinking about how the tools you've acquired so far in your training would be useful with Arab American clients, and how can you polish up your tool belt or yourself so that you are ready to respond. Now that we've kind of explored some of the issues that might be likely to emerge in working with an Arab American community or with Arab American clients, as well as, the counseling or other treatment considerations, let's look back at these in a little bit more detail. Think about the case of Ahmed, the middle schooler who recently relocated to the United States. He's lonely, he's sad, he's not fitting in with the other Arab American kids or the non-Arab American ones. And he's recently gotten into several fights at school. So the principal asked the students to come in and meet with him and one of the school counselors for a consultation. And both parents came to discuss the situation. And the principal is recommending that Ahmed work with the school counselor and possibly a counselor from outside in the community. So during that meetings, the parents are expressing their concerns. They have some questions about the counseling process and they're sharing some hesitation about having their son involved in it, but they're assured that it is viewed as academic support. So they're a little less willing to participate in the community counseling at this point. So imagine yourself as the school counselor here that Ahmed is assigned to. Think about these questions as you're preparing for your work with him. What are some of the approaches that might be less helpful or more helpful? What are some of the strategies or techniques that might be least or most helpful? And in terms of engaging with the family or community, how, if at all, should the family be involved? And which family members should be involved? And in what ways should they be involved? And to what extent is the family involved in the local community or in the near Arab American community? And what extent is Ahmed interested in connecting with the various communities? Are there key people and community leaders who could be helpful in providing support to Ahmed or his family? And how can these or other additional approaches foster resilience among this individual and the family? And then in terms of stigma, how do you think Ahmed might feel about seeing his school counselor? How do you think he's going to feel about having his family involved? How do you think Ahmed's family feels about him and them needing the extra support? And are there other ways in which the psychological distress and other stressors may be manifesting for Ahmed and for the other family members? So let's take a look back at the Aldins. Abdullah has grown concerned about the rifts and the conflicts within his family, and especially with his wife's anxiety and increased isolation. And he spoke generally about it with one of his colleagues who suggested a specific counselor at a local family counseling agency. And according to the colleague, this particular counselor has experience with and also the appreciation of cultural issues. So imagine that you are the family counselor. As you're preparing to work with the Aldens, consider the following issues. What are some of the approaches that might be more or less helpful? What are some of the strategies or techniques that might be least helpful or most helpful? And in terms of engaging with the family and the community, how, if at all, should or could the family be involved? Which family members should or could be involved, and in what ways could they be involved? To what extent is the family involved with the local community? To what extent is the family involved with any Arab American community? And to what extent are the Aldens individually and collectively interested in connecting with the various communities? To what extent are the Aldens connected with their home community and the family in Algeria? And are there key individuals that, or maybe community leaders who could be helpful in providing support to the Alden family? And then in terms of stigmas, how do you think each family member feels about counseling? How do you think each family member might feel about having family members involved? What are some of the possible consequences, either positive or negative, that might occur from this scenario? Are there any other ways in which this psychological distress or other stressors may be manifesting for Nafisa or some of the other family members? Now let's look at Layla. Layla's master program is coming to an end, and she's feeling pressured by her family to make a decision. And while they have been supportive of her educational pursuits, they feel like it's time for her to focus on finding a marital partner alongside her upcoming career goals. And her brothers tease her about being in a men's program and profession. And that's adding to her self-questioning of gender and sexual and career identity issues. And she's feeling a little confused and isolated, so she decides to go to a counseling center to talk to someone about her concerns. So in terms of your approach, what are some of the approaches that might be more or less helpful, or some of the strategies or techniques that might be least or most helpful, or most likely to foster resilience? And then in terms of engaging with the family and the community, how, if at all, should or could the family be involved? And which family members should or could be involved, and in what ways? And to what extent is she involved in the local Arab American community or the local community at large? And are there key individuals or community leaders in the Arab American community or the larger community who could be helpful in providing support for Layla? And then in terms of stigmas, how do you think Layla might feel about counseling? Can you identify any possible cultural stigmas that are involved in Layla's identity development processes, like gender, sexual, career, etc.? And then looking back at Samir, you are a counselor in a veterans hospital, and you receive a referral from one of the physicians for Samir. And he's been coming to the hospital complaining of severe gastrointestinal distress. And although he has undergone a battery of tests, no medical etiology has been determined. So the physician wants you to screen Samir for post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. And Samir is extremely upset about the referral. So he insists that his symptoms are medical, and he does not want to discuss those personal issues with a stranger. But then on the other hand, he knows he needs to be somewhat compliant in order to maintain his veteran administration benefits. So as you're preparing to work with him, think about some of the things that you might do in terms of your approach? Like, what are some of the approaches that might be helpful, more or less helpful? And what are some of the strategies and techniques that might be least helpful or most likely to promote resilience? And then, how, if at all, should the family be involved? And which family members should be involved? And in what ways should they be involved? To what extent is the family involved with the local community or the local Arab community? And what extent are Samir and his family, both individually and collectively, interested in connecting to those various communities? And to what extent are Samir and his family connected with their home community and their family in Australia? Are there key individuals or community leaders who could be helpful in providing support to Samir and his family? And in terms of stigma, how do you think Samir might feel about needing to seek counseling or having his family involved? And how do you think his family feels about him and them needing the extra support? Are there other ways in which this psychological distress and other stressors may be manifesting for Samir and the other family members? So, according to the American Counseling Association, self-awareness and knowledge and skills are the key components to developing basic multicultural counseling competence. So, in counseling Arab Americans, these components can be addressed in a couple of ways, and you can add your own to this list. But the first is self-awareness. So, we really need to learn about like our own personal and cultural biases toward Arab Americans and determine some ways to overcome them. And in doing this, we're going to be able to gain a little bit of increased respect for their Arab or for our clients that are Arab Americans and that have culturally different backgrounds and experiences and values. The next one is knowledge. So when we learn about our own culture, both personally and professionally, it's going to affect our attitude towards Arab Americans, like how oppression and racism and discrimination and stereotyping against Arab Americans may affect our work with those clients, including like assessing that internalized oppression and, how traditional counseling settings might be a little bit incongruent with the cultural values of some Arab American clients, and also like how Arab Americans the help seeking behaviors may affect the counseling process, and how testing and assessment can be culturally biased. So the third one is skills, learning some new ways to seek out education and training and consultation so we can improve our effectiveness in working with Arab American clients, employing a wider range of verbal and nonverbal communication styles and responses, and seeking consultation with supporting personnel. We also want to work to eliminate some biases and prejudices and any discriminatory practices in our counseling settings and our communities. So think about some ways that you can increase your awareness and your knowledge and skills for working with people and families of Arab descent. So, more than ever before, today's counselors are kind of charged with the task of serving as advocates for our clients, both individually, locally, and nationally. And most helping professions have identified this new role as a very critical role in today's world, given that we have, this vast diversity across culture and religion and sexual orientation and so on. So working with Arab Americans in particular, given the post 9/11 climate, that's going to require a knowledge, a little bit of knowledge about U.S. foreign policy towards the Arab Middle East and some of those neighboring regions, and some civil liberty issues around profiling and harassment. And, we need to know a little bit about the laws surrounding immigration and seizure. And all of this, in addition to just the basic multicultural competencies that are applied to Arab American clients, those are the requisites for building resilience effectively. So living within an ethnic enclave can give our clients the necessary support in order to move beyond the initial stages of that identity development and arrive at a mature and consolidated sense of ethnic identity. And people moving into those advanced identity stages could focus on, maybe projecting the positive aspects of their culture with pride in the different communities Maybe support organizations have formed to promote employment, like the Arab American Chamber of Commerce, or maybe they're expanding religious tolerance and understanding, like the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. Maybe they're providing accurate information about the history and the politics of the Middle East, like the Middle East Institute. They're supporting members in the community, like Access, the Arab Community Center for Economic and Social Services. These resources are available to counselors at large who are interested in working with this population. Even outside ethnic enclaves, these organizations have a national scope and they seek to provide information on a national level. And so they can provide the resources necessary to help us as counselors further develop our competencies. So we've